how do we, as a purple team, how do we really start to push the envelope? That's one of the things that MITRE are really, almost obsessed with is let's keep doing good things, but let's just try to figure out, whether it's is there more meat on the bone? There's things a way that we can do this better, are the things we haven't considered, and sometimes there's a failure there. But obviously, as long as we're kind of pushing the right direction, it's a collective win. So particularly today, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about data sources. I know this is a really spicy topic that a lot of us in industry have been circling around. So hopefully this is as much fun for you as it is for me. Let me get back into slides and Flippy. Awesome. So a little bit about myself before I dive in. First thing up front is I am a huge fan of animation. So buckle in. There's going to be a lot of moving parts around this slide deck, but a couple key facts about myself. I know you already touched on this. I am the lead for Attack for Enterprise. So the easiest way to describe that is it's the matrix that's not ICS and mobile. So thinking about things like, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, cloud, network, those techniques. To be completely honest, we spend, almost every day, get a portion of the day writing new technique content, thinking of new technique ideas, taking contributions from the amazing community and baking all that into the framework. Fun fact here is, despite what you might have heard, and I know Katie highlighted this a little bit earlier in the keynote, attack techniques have more than names. There's a bunch of content there. There's there's descriptions, detections, mitigations, data sources. It really kind of captures the perspective of an adversary from a very purple background. So definitely check that out. And we'll do that during this talk as well, kind of exploring some of the good resources there. As you also said, Chris, I am one of the leads for attack evaluations, also known and tracked as UNC 1799. I've also been informed that's not the only threat group I am tracked as, so that's always a fun fact. I think my title at MITRE is accurate in terms of principal adversary, apparently. But as you said, in that process, we do evaluations of various different types of security, vendors, whether that's EDR, XDR, and going forward, we have a couple of really interesting ideas around managed services and other types of security. So a lot of those lessons that I'm talking about today are going to be from that background of really sitting down with a purple team perspective and approach, and what really kind of worked and what potential opportunities we can have to be better about the way we purple team. And just final complete personal fun fact about myself, live in DC. So if anyone, listening now or in the future, this is going to be recorded. If you're ever in the area, hit me up. Happy to hang out and, have a good time. So with that, I did wanted to do a little bit more of a talk that wasn't just, throwing attack at purple team and telling you should use attack. So I started, putting these slides together was, a lot of fun for me, and really a lot of introspection into, we're MITRE, we purple team, we use attack, but why? Like, it's not just because we're MITRE. There's a lot of, gain and a lot of reason that kind of happened. So it took a couple days and kind of just thought about, what is purple teaming? What is it? And, why is attack? And what are the big lessons that we can learn in terms of, attack and other resources that we can apply to being a better purple team? So shout out to the Scythe team. I know George, Sean, Tim, I think Bryson was also an author. The Purple Team Exercise Framework, great resource, really captured. Actually, one of the things I'm, really bad at is writing down ideas. Really captured a lot of the really great ideas that make a purple team a purple team, but also kind of walking you through all the considerations and process. So that really helped me conceptualize a lot of this. But really, looking at that and other resources, the word that I think comes up more than anything in purple team space is that collaboration. The idea that we're bringing in, as Katie and Jordan said earlier, bringing in multiple perspectives and saying, we're solving a hard problem. There's a lot of different takes on this. We need to bring them together. But really, getting back to the main point here was, that all sounds great. Purple teaming and collaboration. Yeah, let's, we can all rally around that and create a good idea. But really, as we start to figure out, are we doing this right? Can we do it better? There's a couple questions we can ask, particularly, what is collaboration? What does purple teaming actually require? What should I prepare myself to have to do? And second question would be, what are going to be the roadblocks during the process? Once we have all these people in a room, once we have, we've got the buy-in, we have all the perspectives, and we close that door, ready to actually, kick this thing off. What kind of roadblocks, have we experienced or can we expect to experience, and how are we going to, bypass those, and using red team language. And then finally, two-part question is, what outputs can we expect? How do we sell this to our management? How do we actually get people to buy in and say, hey, I need your time, and I need your resources, I need your attention to get into this, purple team. But also, how do we measure over time that we're doing it right? Last thing we want to do is be that, proverbial, self-licking ice cream cone. We're purple teaming, we're going through all the motions, but, are we actually, making, is this producing what we expect it to? Are we actually making the changes that we need? Are we getting better at this over time? So I actually use these questions to break down and kind of structure the rest of this talk. I did not want to make another framework. This was not an attempt to make another, another matrix or anything like that. So I apologize, but it did kind of shape up really interesting, inspired by a lot of really other awesome resources. Starting with that question of what does this require? And this is another key thing that I think we'll see in anyone talking about purple teaming, is it starts with communication. And that's not, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth momentarily, but that's not just talking. That's not just, getting your red team and your blue team and your CTI and your stakeholders and your procurement and all those people, management, whoever it is. That's not just, words coming out of their mouth, but most importantly, and I think Jordan and Katie captured this excellently, getting them to listen. So we'll dive into a couple of considerations on, exactly what does that look like. And then second question, challenges. And as perfect as a plan may seem, as we've learned many times, it never really goes exactly like that. Especially, you may have a plan and kind of a course of action that kind of seems like, oh, this is going to work out exactly the way I think it is. But very often, just the reality of life change things. So, one of the biggest, in my experience, particularly the purple team, is, one of the biggest challenges that we'll face is just, as we, as I said, close those doors and get all those perspectives, all of those different priorities and all those different, different considerations and all these ideas really necessarily don't merge gracefully together. And that's why an idea like a common language is going to be really powerful. And so I'll dive in a little bit into that as well. But this is really where, and I think Katie captured it really excellently in the keynote, this is where something like ATT&CK is really going to help you out in terms of, almost having a Rosetta Stone where we can point to the same thing, and, we're all pointing to the same point. And from there, we can pivot into our own spaces, but at least we know we're talking about and tracking the same thing. And finally, this shout out again to the purple team exercise framework, particularly in this case, the maturity model. I think Tim was the main author on that one. So you're really awesome work there. But, in terms of a purple team, I think the biggest question, and we even think about this from like a red team perspective, is why are we doing this? Are we here just to break things? Are we here just to shame, the defenders, or, call out problems? Or are we here to actually create improvements? Are we here to tune? Are we here to learn? So I think, and I'll have a couple, obviously more depth there, but I think, that's a really important consideration in terms of answering that question of, the two-parted question I mentioned earlier. Why are we doing this? How do I get people to come in? And then most importantly, how do I, make sure that we're doing this right? We don't want to just purple team in a fishbowl, come up with a bunch of really good ideas and then it not go anywhere. But also, and I think this is really, kind of topical with, a lot of what's going on right now is, what's setting reasonable expectations in terms of creation, in terms of, are you ever going to solve a problem? Are you fully solve a problem? Are you ever going to fully, validate or have assurance that, this problem that we call cyber or infosec is actually, I'll air quote it, done. So a lot of fun, interesting thoughts that I'm looking forward to dive into there. So without further ado, let's dive in. So George, shout out to you for an excellent quote. I love this, and this is actually one of the philosophies that builds attack itself, is this threat-informed mindset, and that, we can't defend something until we understand it. So, and I think Katie and Jordan did a really great job even highlighting this, is that, understanding is really itself a nebulous concept, in the sense that there are multiple sides of the story of these adversaries. When we look at, particular subset of techniques or TTPs or name actor, there's so many different sides and perspectives in terms of, looking at that, as well as what are we going to do about it, from a, someone writing a defensive analytic, or someone building a sensor, or someone building out content from a red team and writing an intel report, or buying tools, or, training staff. There's so many different considerations when we try to, push all of that together into, that common goal of stopping these adversaries of doing something. So, in terms of a purple team, it's really important, we're not going to perfectly solve that in terms of, creating one kind of perfect, package solution that satisfies all those needs. But that said, during our purple team process, it's really important that we at least understand and respect and kind of appreciate and factor in those considerations. And I think this really gets back to, what George said earlier about kindness, starting with, hey, someone might come during a purple team exercise, someone might come in with, some type of perspective that maybe you don't disagree with, or you don't necessarily understand why they think that way. But that said, rather than, saying, ignoring it, or saying, oh, you're wrong, or, hey, that's not right. What we can do is really start to understand, why is it that you feel that way? Like, what really provoked you to kind of have that take on this problem? Is there a way that we can improve that? Or is that just the limitation of where you are in the situation? And, I just kind of have to deal with it as it is. So I think that was, one of the, at least in my experience, one of the big lessons of this purple team, journey, is really what we're dealing with here is a very human problem, in the sense that, a great example in the slide is, if an alert fires and no one's here to triage it or respond to it, did it really matter? This is not, this cyberspace and this info security, this isn't a problem where we're just going to throw technology on it, at it, and solve the problem. If there was a clear solution, from a technology perspective to solve these problems, we all wouldn't be here. I think we would hopefully collectively have already figured that out. So it really is important when you're going through this process to keep that in mind, so that, you can factor that into, the way that we collaborate and the way we actually create solutions. So, kind of, getting back into, now that we've kind of understood the communication problem, we can start to think about how can we be better. And, one of the biggest lessons for me was learning how to speak someone else's language. Most importantly, as we said, when we close that door, we bring all these different perspectives in a room, they're all going to have, their own vested interest. They're all going to have their own priorities. They're all going to have different ways that they think about the problem. So what we can do from, a red perspective, a blue perspective, is exactly, and I love the way Jordan highlighted it, is start to think about, what does the other side, what matters to them? How do they think about the problem, and how can I frame the way I communicate in a way that will resonate with them? Just an example, thinking about it from a red perspective, I don't necessarily need to know everything they do, but at the same time, I can be better about, meeting them in the middle and saying, I understand that you're coming at this from a, alert generation perspective. So everything, my outputs and the way I frame, the way we're doing this needs to really kind of meet there. And then, other important thing about getting back to the human element of this is, exactly as I said before, this isn't a space where we are going to just have, binary solutions of, I wrote this thing, it solved this problem, and I'm done. So as part of this communication, part of this, this bigger story, we really need to step in and start to understand, hey, you are where you are for a lot of reasons. Are these, exactly as the slide says, are, rather than coming in with the ego and saying, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? I was able to bypass this. I was able to fly into flaw in that. rather than just kind to, hit on that and saying, oh, well, you're not doing a good job, or you don't know this, you don't know that. Really take the time to understand, why are you there? Like, is it a reality of, you would love to do that, you just don't have the time and resources to, or there's some technical limitation. Because as a purple team, getting back to the bigger goal here, our goal is to not to shame or to find flaws and kind of, take the hill and celebrate as a red team. It's more to, meet them in the middle, understand, this is where you are, this is your reality, and let's drive forward together. Let's help tell the story about how we're improving together. So that togetherness is all going to center around this idea of, and I hate to just steal and kind of ride the thunder of the previous two talks, but understanding your audience and their stakeholders. And I think this is where we, as purple teamers, we can learn and leverage a lot of the lessons from CTI in terms of how do you tell a good story. And telling a good story all starts with, seeing the problem and seeing the story from the eyes of your audience. So as, getting into purple team specifics, we can really dive into, when you're talking, depending on who your audience is, there's different metrics and different, everyone likes scores, everyone likes ranks and these, hard quantifiable values. We can start to think about, who am I talking to and how are they going to translate what I'm communicating into the way they think? So a good example would be, as a red teamer, I've never run a successful Splunk query. I've never done a threat hunt hands-on. I've only come from it from the intel, offensive perspective. But that said, there's no reason that I can't understand concepts such as visibility and coverage and mean time to detect and false positives, because all of that's going to really round out the way, not only I, but as a collective purple team, we deliver our message. So it really is important that you dive in and kind of make those considerations. And this is where ATT&CK is really going to play a big part. So, obligatory, like I said, for MITRE, obligatory ATT&CK slide. But this isn't just, fluff. This isn't just, oh, cool. Like, we're just talking about ATT&CK because that's what everyone uses. Really, in the context of a purple team, ATT&CK is really going to enable that purple team multiple perspective communication, in the sense of, we're looking at this as the enterprise matrix. Obviously, it breaks down the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we are tracking from your adversaries. But ATT&CK is more than that. It's going to be exactly as I said. It's not just these pretty names and these technique IDs that we can use and tag things, throw them over the fence and hope that the purple team, or the blue team acts on it. What we can really start to do is use the common language of ATT&CK to decompose our own story. So as an example here, shout out to the Wover, or I guess the real Wover on Twitter. Something like donut. That's something a lot of adversaries, a lot of red teamers have used, and particularly to reflectively load code into memory. Particularly, I think it's exclusively .NET code. So I just said that a lot of Intel analysts, a lot of blue teamers, that might not be the way they think about the problem. That might be a lot of words or jargon that they're not necessarily used to. And this is where ATT&CK can really start to play a big part in terms of not only defining a common language and something that we can point them to. In this case, there's a particular technique that we can say, to learn more about this, reference this. There's a really great write-up that really kind of explains what this, one aspect of donut is really all about. But also, like I said before, the perspective problem of really diving in and saying, hey, what actors are actually using that? Is this something that I actually care about testing? In this case, we can use procedure examples as, who's using this? And exactly as Katie said earlier, are there considerations in terms of, are these the type of threats that are in our model? Or are these the ones we care about? And we can really start to unpack, what does an emulation of this really look like in terms of, something I care about or something that maybe I don't care about. But also giving some shout out and love to our blue team partners. What does the other side of this look like? The adversary perspective, okay, donut, cool tool, reflective code loading. But as a defender, what am I going to do about it in terms of, we'll start with detections. So just kind of diving in a little further, a big thing I want to talk about here was data sources and components. So the big theme of the talk was, these particular terms, why should a red team, blue teamers live in this space, they think about this space, but why should a red teamer really invest the time speaking in this? So before I go any further, I want to explain this concept a little more. So ATT&CK, we recently updated our data source and data sources data component model to kind of be this two-part system. So, data source is going to be what type of data do I need to collect? Common examples of that would be, data about a file, data about a registry key, data about a network connection, whatever it is. And then data components are going to be, within that type of data, are there specific values or specific elements that I need to care about? Is it the, the creation of a process? Is it the, access of a process? The, the change to a file, the creation of the file, whatever it is. So some examples are there. There's a lot of really great content out there about like kind of the scope and kind of prioritization of those. But, as a red teamer, even getting down to this level of detail is going to be powerful because, rather than coming at you with this, oh, I'm using Donut in your environment and here's a link to GitHub, we can start to, exactly in the spirit of Purple Team, start to translate this red tradecraft into blue operations. So, as you can see in the slide, we can use ATT&CK to take a concept like Donut, translate that to a technique, and rather than just saying, okay, you need to start learning to detect Donut, we can use data sources to really translate that into a more nuanced question, such as, how, now that I've looked at those data sources, particularly on that technique, maybe I can ask a really nuanced question of, how do I detect module loads into abnormal processes? And, from that question, we can start to, as the slide says, create, tangible impacts, such as, shout out to Sigma. They have a Sigma analytic for exactly this problem. They're looking for image loads into scripting processes, which, starts to beg a different question. Is, okay, we red teamed something, we translated it, we asked a good question, we found an analytic, are we done? Shout out to Matt Graber. I love this quote. And that really encapsulates a lot of, exactly what I'm saying is, now that we're creating things and we've kind of worked through this process, how do we know if we're doing a good job? How do we know if we're done? Is there even a done? So looking at, this example, no matter what, this is a really great analytic. That can be bypassed. We can very clearly see the limitations of, what it's looking for and start to use that red perspective to get around those. And that is honestly not a bad thing. That's great. That's fantastic, because that, with the context and the realization that, rather, we're never going to really find that done, but rather we should keep pushing and striving for, rather than done, let's aim for better. And I think this is better. So with that, I'm going to walk through a couple more quick examples just to drive home this point. Big point is, we're not going to ever find that mystical 100% attack coverage, especially, as we start to work our way down from tactics, techniques, into the infinite abyss of procedures. And, in reality, the limitations that, defense, just, the reality presents itself that we're not going to solve these problems perfectly. So cool example, shout out to the D4 report for breaking down Cobalt Strike. One of my things back in the day that I used to use commonly in Cobalt Strike was the spawn to. So basically what it's doing is process hollowing into a new process and setting up another beacon from a separate process. So now that we can communicate that, we can start to think about, how do I put that in the context of a common language? So looking at ATT&CK, we can identify there is a process injection technique specifically about process hollowing, and identifies 3 potential data sources and data components that we can use to defend that. Are we done there? Not necessarily. Now let's actually start to create content to actually defend that. Process API monitoring is a nightmare. Good luck scaling that. There's some use cases where it might be applicable, but in this case, it's realistically say not something we can do. So let's take a look at the other 2 data components, particularly starting with process access. Go to ATT&CK. Example there, sysmon event ID 10. Okay, great. That sounds like something I can do. Check it out. Shout out to Olaf. In the sysmon config, he has a rule for exactly this. We're going to particularly look at process access flags, particularly those associated with suspended processes. This might help us find, process hollowing from Cobalt Strike. But again, the question is this done? Can this be bypassed? Or more importantly, is this better than where we were before we had this? Another example, everyone's favorite, as Katie said earlier, dual use tool, BloodHound. So very simple to execute from the red perspective. You just run sharp-hound, good, goes out and collects a bunch of really awesome Active Directory data. Sorry about that, double skipped. Slide, go to attack, search BloodHound. You actually find that we track this as software mapped to many different techniques. Now we have to start to think about from purple team perspective, are we going to go through and kind of try to defend every one of those techniques? Or, is there a better approach here? And I think very often from, and this is a really important perspective from, kind of the assessment, structure is, very often you'll be asked, how do we defend BloodHound? Are we going to decompose this into multiple techniques? Or are there lessons we can learn from a more collective, perspective? So in this case, shout out to MITRE, did a really great breakdown of what BloodHound looks like from a client and server perspective. And, same thing before about translating this from, common language to actual tangible outputs. We can start to decompose these and say, network connections can be mapped to a certain data source, name pipes can map to others, and also a lot of Active Directory logging is going to be really relevant here. And from all that, we can start to actually look, is this something we can do in our environment? And again, like I said before, is it done or is it just better? And final example, everyone's favorite hacker group, LAPSUS. One of the interesting things they did from a recent Microsoft report is trigger these multi-factor authentication prompts, basically just brute forcing, hey, if I ask the user enough, eventually they'll grant me access to a login. So taking that to attack, two techniques here, valid accounts, and I'm not going to say the name of the second one because it's not released yet, still under construction, but there's a technique ID. And we can find, like I said, from a red team perspective, find those data sources, find those data components, and start to ask, our blue team counterparts the right questions, particularly, how do we detect that? Is this something we can do? User account create authentication, those are basically going to be every authentication attempt. Maybe not something that's realistic for us. That's just a reality of defense. But let's take a look at the second two components and say, well, logins. That seems like something we can do. Take a look at that data component and realize, there's different couple places depending on the system where this might be relevant. It could be a 4622. It could be, in some type of Unix log. But most importantly, thinking back to the big picture here is we can start to leverage all these resources and figure out what does this look like in our environment relative to this particular behavior. So shout out to Microsoft for this really great hunting tip, particularly basically what the search does is look for logins from known VPS networks that are using, basically tokens as an authentication, kind of what was the main credential provided. And again, not perfect, not done, but, again, better and a step in the right direction. So just wrapping up, I know we're coming on time here, but, big picture of, the lessons learned here is going to be stop asking for done. That's not going to be a reality. More important is, let's just try to improve. And that improvement is really going to only be enabled if we can understand, not just the other side, red versus blue, but exactly as Katie and Jordan said, understand the different perspectives that are going into this and learn to not only, tell them a story, but help tell their story, particularly, finding where they are, dropping egos and saying, this is where you are. This is, the realities of your situation. Let's tell a better story going forward. So I think I have maybe a time for one question, but just wanted to thank you all again for hosting. And here's some really great links that, I kind of go back to regularly in this beautiful journey that we call purple teaming. So with that, pending any questions, just wanted to thank you all again and have a happy almost National Unicorn Day.